Welcome to the Whole Enchilada, a community of high achievers that fight the status quo, rebel against mediocrity, and make life happen. Let's go.
Hey, Enchilada Nation, excited for the conversation we're going to have. It's actually an economic conversation. I invited three of my good friends and some of the smartest people I know that are constantly analyzing the market in their current areas to have the discussion with us in regards to the global economy, the national economy, and how do we drive that into our local economies and operate as entrepreneurs. So this is a three-part episode. I hope you enjoy it. Lean into the conversation. I would love to hear your feedback on what you believe the market's going to do. Okay, Johnny, bring us home to the U.S.
Inflation, right? That's always been the story. I think I've learned more about the Fed the last 12 months. I think we've all cared to learn more about the Fed the last 12 months than ever in our lifetime, just because the whammy or the kick in the pants we've had so quickly in a 12-month period with them raising that Fed funds rate. But I think, the Fed in general, the handful of tools they have, I think Dana nailed it. But I remember 25 years ago when I was in driver's ed, hearing about a post-World War II study when they were building all the freeways and highways. The optimal speed limit to drive across the country, they determined to use oil the most efficiently was 55 miles per gallon. So they kind of determined the optimal speed we should be driving at to use resources the most effectively. And the economy is the same way, right? That 2246 she mentioned. And as soon as anything gets out of whack, the Fed has to use one of their levers, the federal government, to start either slowing it down or speeding it up. And interest rates clearly is one of those they've used to intentionally deliberately slow our economy, right? And normally the Fed will say one thing and 1,000 things will hit the news out of that one thing that the Fed said. So there's a lot of speculation that hits Forbes and every other news thing out there. But we went from 0 to 5% on that Fed funds rate very quickly, right? Which was whiplash for our industry. Hasn't been as fast or quick for a lot of other industries. But clearly they're trying to raise that up. And we keep talking about the soft landing, which the soft landing is almost a miraculous output of raising the rates. Because how do we raise the rates enough that it slows the economy so perfectly that it doesn't create unemployment and doesn't drop GDP, right? Which is a miraculous outcome. And hopefully it can still happen. But the likelihood of unemployment going up or GDP going down, which is why they haven't called us an official recession, is because we haven't had GDP and unemployment all kind of decrease at the same time. So if they're doing a decent job, like they probably are, but the stubbornness of that core inflation has surprised me personally. How fast we went up to 5% and core inflation just kind of trickling down. The overall inflation that includes the energy and food that can be manipulated a little bit more. Biden can write a letter and deplete some of our oil reserves just to temporarily lower gas prices. Clearly that's why core inflation is the one I care about, but we still have some room to go. We're trying to get down to that 2%. The other one that we don't talk about a lot is just they're always buying assets. When I loan you $50,000, $50,000 is out of my bank account, right? Which is what happens with banks. Right now, the Fed is in getting some of those assets off their balance sheet. They've decreased the assets that the Federal Reserve is holding to the point that what happens is credit tightens up at the same time. So I think we're kind of getting double whammied a little bit in the fact that rates are going up and credit is kind of tightening in availability. So I just personally, I was way more optimistic 3-6 months ago. There's always studies that go out of what rates are going to do. October, I think we're fine. There could be another 25 basis points coming in November. The soft landing is still potential, but it seems a little less likely the last month or two. I thought we would come around holidays, maybe early spring, and we might see some rate reductions. I think we're going to kind of hover at this. My opinion. I think we're going to hover at these Fed rates deep into 2024, which will probably tell you mortgage rates aren't going to really move that much unless we see a decrease in rates. And I think they want to see that core inflation come down before they move any levers to actually spur the economy, right? Do you guys agree with pretty much all that? Or
I totally agree with all of that. Yes. And I think too, it's interesting if you listen to some of the research that we were even provided at Mega Camp and prior to hear Gary's research team, excuse me, talk about it too. 2 years ago, the average American had the most cash in their savings account than they had in the last decades. And year to date this year, they have the lowest amount of cash already that quick. And they have the highest credit card debt than they've had. And I think the problem is, and we actually talk about this a lot, instead of reducing personal expenses, people have gotten accustomed to a lifestyle. And, to some point, maybe all of us might be a little guilty of that, but we don't want to change the ways that we have been living or going on. We went from going on one vacation a year to people were then, 3-4 vacations a year. And so as we try to adjust, I think people have a hard time with that. And I think that that's what's caused us to be where we are today. And then you combine that with student debt and everybody's payments getting ready to start in October. I mean, I think there's a lot that goes into play with that. But yeah, I agree. I think rates will likely end close to where they are now. And I think we'll go, when Gary said September, we'll feel like we've fallen off a cliff. I don't necessarily know as much about how your all's local market is, and I'm big on your local market. But ours are, we are trending quite down.
Yeah, I think I actually got a little faster just because we went up, but our units drop, that type of stuff. But I think every market's a little bit different. What were you gonna say, Marcus?
Yeah. I was just gonna say, I think you're nailing the conversation. Obviously, in simplest forms, the Fed's looking for less cash flow to flow around the same way it has, right? We all know how hard it is to create a new good habit, and it's equally hard to break a bad habit. We've got, because of people having that extra cash you were talking about in the savings, and some of it was even weird because the government was putting money in people's account, like, oh, whoa, I am saving money. Look how good I am. And they've increased these habits of spending, and they don't want to change that habit of spending. And so they ate up all that saving. To your point, consumer debt is the highest it's ever been. This, to me, is what could potentially topple the market, is what happens next. Because if savings is gone, consumer debt is high, at some point the credit cards companies are going to be like, okay, we're tapping you out. Where do they go next for cash? Equity, which right now over 60% of homes across the country are equity rich. This is the most equity rich homes have ever been in the United States. The good news is, and I say good news hesitantly, because the good news is, because people are so equity rich, it could take them a while, because that's a lot of Starbucks lattes to eat up a couple $100,000 of equity, but it will add up very quickly. If the economy doesn't turn and get better before people eat up that equity, that's when we could start seeing foreclosure notices increase, and that could topple the market. When people talk about a big shift or a bubble, that could happen in that event. It just really depends how long are people going to ride that out with eating up equity. Any thoughts on that, guys?
I agree with you, because again, expenses move way slower than income. So if income drops, it takes a lot longer for us to behaviorally change to decrease expenses. And part of that is, that's why, the personal savings is very low. I can kind of understand that, because incomes haven't really gone up. Your dollar goes a little less far. So your disposable income percent that's going to savings, it probably is at record lows a little naturally. And consumer debt is highest just because our lifestyles haven't changed. Incomes aren't doing what they used to. So naturally, we're just going to put that on debt. With credit, running out, do people change because they want to, or because they're compelled to? Mostly. Most of the people just get to worst case scenario, they're compelled to change. And as soon as credit starts running out for these people, they're either going to drastically change behavior, or they're going to tap into assets. And I think that's it. But I think hopefully we can recover fast enough that we don't see that tapping into assets as extreme as we have in other shifts, which is a little bit more of that soft landing, right?
Hey, Marcus, do you guys feel like in your market, because I'm in 4 different states in 4 totally different markets, so I kind of have a different view and perspective of all the 4 different ones. Do you guys feel like, though, in your market, buyers have finally said, I'm not going to pay that for that house? Whereas 2 years ago, it was kind of whatever, if I want it, I'm going to pay for it. And now I feel like they're kind of that's too much. The threshold has been met, and I'm not going to pay that for that house.
Oh yeah, totally. Right. And just because mortgage rates went up so much that it just doubled their payments so quickly that I think most of them couldn't even buy or pay for that, and it really has hurt the whole K economy. If you owned a bunch of stuff before all this happened, at least you have some options. People that have been chasing the market, it's so hard, which is the difference from this versus the Great Recession that most of us were probably in, is just values have stayed the same, even though those units are down. We're dealing with some of the challenging things in the economy, but the fact that we're underbuilt in this country versus overbuilt has kept things from depreciating, overall, or even at a significant level, which has just crushed that affordability, And so even like one of the questions you said, buyer desire remains high, but something's got to give. Either we're eventually going to have to see some of those rates come down, prices come down, or incomes go up. What's the most likely? Hopefully if the economy can recover, we can lower rates. The second option would be prices will have to come down,
Jonny, you just said a term that I've been using around that I think is really critical right now is that this is the good news that could turn our market the other way, right? Which is buyer desire. Like we historically just talk about buyer demand, but buyer demand equals buyer desire plus buyer ability. And so the good news is in most markets, buyer desire is high. Most markets, not all markets, most markets are still behind on inventory needed. So there is buyer desire, but to your point, Dana, some people are saying like, I want to do something. It just doesn't make sense, or I don't have the ability to do it to some extent. I don't make enough money. Interest rates are too high, whatever it is. So like we used to just talk about buyer demand as this bigger thing, but we need to say like, okay, good news, buyer demand remains high, buyer desire. How do we fix that problem? How do we close that gap? Because then it will trigger more buys if we can get sellers to put the properties on the market. One question I have for you guys is I saw a report from a credit card company. I think it was American Express, and they kind of allocated where are people spending the majority of their money. Any guesses from you guys on what was the number one thing people were using their credit card to spend money on over the last several years?
Food.
Yeah, I was going to say food too. Food and or trips.
I'd say healthcare.
Travel and food, which it's interesting from a decision-making standpoint, like their ability to pull back on those things. It's not taking away necessities, right? Like healthcare, like you were talking about, Joe, but it's this idea of how could, if people could just make the decision to slow down their spending on travel and food, it would significantly decrease the flow of money in the market, which may be enough to change how the Fed is showing up. But the interesting thing is on the other side of that is I just saw a report from Airbnb that the revenue in Airbnb across the country is down more than 50% across the country. So maybe finally the consumer saying, okay, let's do less, unless they're going to the Four Seasons now instead of the Airbnb.
Hard to do the groceries too when one organic red pepper is $3.99 at Whole Foods now. I mean, it's crazy.
Yeah. So that's the question. Will consumers stop going to the Whole Foods and start going to the Smiths? Or will the consumer stop traveling 4 times a year and maybe one trip a year that they're driving to the destination? Like, you'll be interested to see if people start shifting a little bit of how still maintaining a lifestyle, but shifting how they're changing.
Well, that's what Gary said once, is just, we keep talking about these fictitious people out there. And until you personally are like not going on the trips, not trading in your car, not door dashing versus cooking your own grilled cheese or whatever, like until you personally are making those decisions, you're not going to naturally just see everybody else do it as well,
Love it. Joe, did you want me to pull up those images on the email?
I mean, I think they're interesting to look at, but I would follow into the consumer purchasing. I forget which chart I was looking at, but since the pandemic happened with the injection of capital from the government, right, from what I understood from this article was that we had savings of about 190 billion in the U.S. economy, and we were burning through about 110 billion a month of that savings. So you're looking somewhere in October, November that any of those savings that happened at the beginning of the pandemic is pretty much gone. So I think you're absolutely right that we're gonna get to a place probably in November where people make those hard changes of where they purchase and travel and things like that. That slide that you've got up, Marcus, I think is also very important for everybody on this call, is that if you look at how wealth is divided in the U.S., for the top 1% and the top 20%, taking out the top 1%, you can see the first dark blue is actually real estate investments. So if you look at where the primary driver of like wealth creation, the top 1 and top 20%, you see a good section of it being in real estate.
Yeah.
Awesome. Love that one. And then did you give me another one? Do you want me to pull up?
I don't know if it's there was another one. I don't know if it's gonna open up or not, but the other slide that I was sending over that I believe is the best indicator for our current economics is interest rates typically trend in parallel unison with unemployment rates. And if you look at our interest rates that Jonny brought up, from January to now has gone up 500 basis points, which is the fastest it's ever gone in the period of time. Our unemployment rates have not trended with that, which is why we haven't seen like a full-on recession. So my thing that I'm watching personally is interest rates go up, unemployment hasn't. When you start to see unemployment go up, that's when you're going to have an indicator of a recession, because right now the unemployment rates being low means people can pay and consume in the U.S. economy. The moment they stop consuming, we're going to have that recession come up. So that's what I've been watching personally to see when there's going to be a shift in our markets.
All right, everybody. Thank you for leaning into the conversation. I am so grateful for my dear friends leaning in and giving me their insight on what's going on in the economy. I hope that you learned something from the conversation and took away a couple nuggets. Now the idea is, how do you utilize that information to go improve your current situation and have the conversation with the people in your world? And as always, don't forget, go live life on your terms.